Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here once again with an Elder Scrolls Online Let's Talk segment. This time we will be discussing the One Hand and Shield skill line in the Elder Scrolls Online. This tree line, while primarily meant for tanks, can also be utilized in PvP, not only making the user tankier but allowing for some deceptive damage as well. Let's kick things right off with our active abilities. Our first active ability is called Puncture. It is a melee casted ability, will be casted from a 5 meters range at maximum. Since it deals physical damage, it will scale off of Mighty, Piercing, and Precise Strikes in the champion point system. It will also scale off of max stamina, weapon damage, weapon critical, and armor penetration. This is the primary spammable quote-unquote that we'll be using in PvP or as a tank. And I use air quotes when I say spammable in the application of a tank, because this will also be our taunt. The taunt applies a 15-second debuff onto the enemy, which forces them to attack you and ignores all other aggro or hatred generators. So for 15 seconds after applying this, they are forced to attack you. The only time they will lose aggro is if they're doing a mechanic that targets another player, or if that mob ignores aggro. So there are a few bosses in the game that will completely ignore this, such as the Planar Inhibitor in White Gold Tower, and a few other fights, such as Daedra in Direfrost Keep. Those are just to name a few. There are many more. Not only does it do some moderate damage, but it also applies major fracture to the enemy, reducing their physical resistance by a whopping 5280 for 12 seconds. So the debuff lasts 12 and the taunt lasts 15, meaning you'll have to taunt every 12 seconds. Some things to note about this: major fracture in and of itself offers us 8% damage in PvP application. So remember, PvP resistances are divided by 660, and then in PvE it gives us a massive 10.56% damage increase with physical attacks or physical penetrative attacks. Because in PvE, mobs are considered level 50 instead of champion point 160 as players are, so theirs is divided by 500, giving us the 10.56. So this is a very, very strong debuff to keep up, not only to force things to attack you as a tank, to make sure that they aren't wailing on your allies, but also to debuff the enemy so they're taking more damage. Not only is this fantastic for PvE, but this is also a very strong skill for PvE due to how fluidly this skill operates. If you notice here, it's a very easy ability to use over and over, does some moderate upfront damage, and it doesn't even cost that much. On top of this, since it does apply the debuff, you'll also increase your own damage against the enemy. Now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Ransack. All Ransack does is, after casting it on top of debuffing the enemy with Major Fracture, you gain Minor Resolve, which increases your physical resistance by 1320 for 12 seconds. And since this is a player, this is divided by 660, meaning it will give us a flat 2% damage mitigation against physical penetrative attacks. This means physical damage, disease damage, and poison damage. Pretty lackluster, in my opinion. Minor Resolve, while nice, isn't going to make or break you dying. Hitting mitigation cap isn't necessarily hard either, and there are much more efficient ways to get Minor Resolve, regardless of whatever class you're playing. Some through buffs, some through sets, and some through other abilities. So I really don't like Ransack. I feel like it should do a little bit more. Perhaps increase the amount of physical penetration you apply, or does something else that is not in the form of Minor Resolve, because as it stands, Ransack really doesn't have a place, and that's because we'll look at our other morph, and that is Pierce Armor. And Pierce Armor, in addition of adding Major Fracture to the enemy, it also applies Major Breach, meaning they'll reduce their physical and spell resistance by the 5280 for 12 seconds. So all this does is it makes sure that the enemy takes, either in PvP, 8% more damage from all attacks, or in PvE, 10.56% damage from all attacks, allowing for a much more readily accessible debuff in terms of application, so a tank is always going to be taunting. Now, there's a lot of misconception about this ability in terms of how it interacts with other abilities. So there was a bug a very long time ago, before 1 Tamriel, when cross-faction raiding became a thing, and the bug was Pierce Armor made it so enemies outside of your faction could not benefit from Elemental Drain's Magicka return if Pierce Armor was applied after. Now, this is not in the game anymore, so there is no reason not to take Pierce Armor. There's a lot of people who still believe in this bug, and that's because there's a lot of misinformation. People don't double test. People who do test don't test properly. So you have to make sure you're checking multiple things at once. You check alone, you check with another player, and then you check with a player of an opposite faction inside of a PvE area, just to make sure you cover all situations where this could possibly bug out. So again, I'll repeat, Pierce Armor is no longer bugged. It will not remove Elemental Drain. And even further, if it was, in some odd way, it will be redundant next patch, because Minor Magicka Steel will be the application from Elemental Drain, Force Siphon, and Radiant Aura, negating the purpose to ever even need to run Elemental Drain, therefore no longer causing any problems. So, aside from all of that, Pierce Armor is going to be the by far better morph, because we're going to get all of that 10.5% or 10.56% damage in PvE or 8% in PvP against whatever target we're hitting, and it's very easy for a tank to apply this instead of other players, so it's extremely efficient. And while it doesn't do anything for the tank user, it does benefit the group in an extreme sort of way, because 10.56% damage is massive. Now we'll look at our next ability, and that is Low Slash. Low Slash is a bit of a heftier cost than our Puncture, almost double in size, can still be casted from 5 meters range, will still scale with all of the same stuff as Puncture will, just like everything in this skill line. All it does is you hit an enemy, it'll do a little bit more damage than Puncture, and then it will put a snare on them, reducing their movement speed by 60% for 12 seconds. Furthermore, the target you cast this upon will be inflicted with Minor Maim, causing them to deal 15% less damage for the 12-second duration. This is extremely vital for many tanks who do not have ease of access to Minor Maim, such as Templars or Sorcerers. However, Low Slash in and of itself does not function better to, say, Choking Talons or Shades for the Nightblade class, because Low Slash's high stamina cost, while the other ones will cost Magicka, allowing us to block longer. So in terms of tanking in PvE, we don't want to spam Low Slash on everything, because it's going to drain our stamina pool rather quickly. Notice here, while I'm not min-maxed or set up to be an optimal tank, you see how draining it is to cast this ability. So, Low Slash in and of itself is strong, but we don't want to overcast it. We're only wanting to cast it at most of 12 seconds, and if we have access to it in our kit elsewhere based on our class or other things, we'll probably want it there. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Deep Slash, and what it does is it adds a cleave component, allowing you to hit up to 2 nearby enemies. The 2 nearby enemies will not take the full damage of the initial hit, however, they will all be snared, and they will all be inflicted with Minor Maim, allowing you to cover more targets, causing you to not have to cast it as much. So Deep Slash is a fantastic option if you do not have an AoE source of Minor Maim, such as Choking Talons. Very, very helpful for that regard, and it even gives some cleave damage in PvP. However, there are probably better options for us, so we're not really going to use it there. But the other morph is called Heroic Slash, and this is usually the go-to for many tanks, because on top of all of the fantastic things of the snare and the Minor Maim, we'll also grant ourselves Minor Heroism for 9 seconds, granting us 1 ultimate generation every 1.5 seconds. So base ultimate generation is 3 every 1.5. With Minor Heroism and that, it's 4 every 1.5. So this is going to be a little bit helpful. It's not going to really change the tide of battle too much, but in terms of PvE, especially when you're wanting to throw out war horns or damage reduction for your group, in other forms, Heroic Slash is really going to help you get that faster, allowing you to impact your group a little bit more. So if you don't have access to Minor Heroism elsewhere in your kit, then Heroic Slash is going to be a really nice buff to keep up. However, I don't think it's as mandatory as people make it seem. The reason why we run this skill is not because Minor Heroism, but rather because Minor Maim. Minor Maim is going to reduce the damage done of all attacks from an enemy. And while some, like in PvE, you think, okay, well, that guy is doing a lot of damage to me, but most of the mechanics are actually hitting my other allies, and they're not being done from this enemy. Take Rakat, for instance. There is a mechanic called Void Spheres, where these little orbs come out from the center of the platform and deal lots of damage. You'd think, okay, well, Rakat himself is not dealing this damage, so I can't apply Minor Maim to that. However, you would be incorrect, because all mechanics are bound to the boss of the fight you are encountered with. So applying Minor Maim will reduce all damage done by mechanics in the fight by 15%. This means Void Spheres, Unstable Void, Breath of Lorcage, all of these in Rakat, Poisonous Ground, World Shaper, although you're probably going to die anyways to that. But all damage mechanics that are related to a boss will be applied or will be affected by Heroic Slash or Minor Maim. So this is a very, very important skill to keep up, because it's going to offer a lot of effective health or artificial health to your allies, because your enemies will be dealing less damage, meaning they won't have to run as much health. If you keep up Minor Maim on an enemy all the time, there's not much of a reason to be stacking 20k health. So it's your job as a tank, in terms of group utility, to perform this function of Minor Maim to targets that need to have it applied to them, so that your group can maximize their damage output, as well as making sure as little people are taking damage as possible. So this is a very, very strong skill, but that's because Minor Maim. So if you remove that, then we wouldn't even run this skill at all. So that's what I meant with people think it's mandatory to run Heroic Slash. No, it's mandatory to run Maim. So if you have Maim on your kit, you don't need to run Slash. Still, in and of itself, it is a fantastic skill for both PvE and in PvP, because that snare is going to be really bothersome. Maim is going to make those gankers do less damage. It's going to allow you to peel for your healers, etc. When they're being like put on pressure and stuff, you'll be able to put Maim on all of the targets hitting them, and then kind of give them some breathing room. So very, very nice skill. Our next skill is called Defensive Posture, and if you notice here, there is no scaling mechanism for Defensive Posture, because it will not deal any damage or healing, therefore will have no scaling. Instead, it operates as a buff. So all you do is you cast it, and it grants you a buff where any spell casted at you, it has to be a spell projectile, will be reflected back at the enemy, and it will then consume the buff. So you'll see here, I'll cast this ability. Now I have a 30-second window where any spell projectile casted at me will bounce back, hit them instead of me. Very straightforward. So remember, it says spell projectile. This means it has to scale with magicka. It has to either deal magic damage, fire, ice, or shock. So it has to be one of those. It can't be physical damage. So will not reflect poison injection, will not reflect snipe, because those are not considered spells. It must be a spell. On top of being able to do this, this will also have a passive component where while you have this on your bar and a shield equipped, and then you will increase the amount of damage you can block by 8% and reduce the cost of blocking by 8%. This isn't going to be a whole 8%, as it will be applied multiplicatively to other bonuses, meaning it's not going to get the full efficiency of 8% unless your block cost is so high. Still, this will likely be hit by diminishing returns if you're using things like champion points or sturdy or block cost reduction jewelry enchants, so it's not going to be the full 8%. There are a lot of really good guides out there in terms of explaining that. You can just simply look them up. I will not reference them here because I'm not familiar with the creators of them. Regardless, on the official forums, and many YouTubers have gone through and explained block cost reduction, so I will not do so. It should be noted that casting Defensive Posture while it does require a sword and board to cast, it doesn't necessarily require a sword and board to be active to gain benefit of it. So you can cast Defensive Posture as such, and then swap to a non-sword and board, and we'll still retain this passive. And this is not a visual error. If you go out and you go demonstrate, and you find an enemy in PvP or in PvE that casts a spell on you, you will notice that the Reflect still retains. The same can be said about the Morph. So the really helpful thing about this skill is not only are they strong, but they don't require you to double bar sword and board to gain benefit of. So you can cast this and swap to your offensive bar like a two-hander or a bow or a staff even if you're going the caster route, and you can retain that passive bonus of reflecting or absorbing the next attack without having your sword and shield out. So very powerful way to utilize this skill. In and of itself, Defensive Posture is a little bit lacking in my opinion. The passive skill is very nice. However, I do not think that it is justified as a bar slot just for this, because we can run a lot better utility. However, when we look at our morphs, that'll kind of change things. The first morph we have is called Defensive Stance, and this is the go-to PvP morph, because instead of only reflecting spells against you, it will change that any spell casted at you will be reflected. So any ranged attack, snipe, etc. will be blocked back. Not only will it deal the full damage to the enemy that casted it at you, but it will also stun them for 3 seconds. So this is a really nice option, because not only does it allow us to reflect more skills than Defensive Posture, but it'll also add a stun component. So unless an enemy dodge rolls the reflect that they hit, then they're going to be taking not only a lot of upfront damage, but they'll also be stunned for 3 seconds, either forcing them to take more damage or CC break. So this is usually the go-to morph for PvP, just because you're going to be hit with a lot of nasty skills like snipe, crystal frags, and doing a lot of burst damage back to the enemy, and stunning them really helps alleviate pressure and put them on the defensive instead of you. Our next morph is the go-to PvE morph, and that is called Absorb Magic. Now, this can be used in PvP and in PvE quite efficiently, and I really like this morph. What it does is the next spell projectile you have cast at you will not be reflected, but instead will be consumed in form of a damage shield. So you'll see here that it has a coefficient, and all this does is it will scale off of max health as well as the Bastion and Champion Point system, because it operates as a damage shield, but it will not consume non-spell damage attacks. So it has to be a spell projectile similar to the base morph, but when one is casted at you, you will consume up to 11k damage. Obviously this will go up based on how high your health is and your Bastion allocation, so you can get this up much higher, but on top of negating a big portion of the damage you'll take, but you'll also heal yourself for 12% of your max health, allowing for some insane self-healing when used in key situations. So in PvE, you can use this on a lot of boss fights, because a lot of boss fights have spell projectiles. Look at fights like Lord Warden in Imperial City Prison, or even elite mobs that sit afar and cast things from their staves. Pretty much every boss in the game has some sort of spell projectile that Absorb Magic can be utilized with. You can use it on Rakat, his mechanic deemed gun. It will be called Dark Barrage, is considered a spell projectile, meaning you can literally sit there and spam cast this, absorbing tons of damage and healing yourself every time you get hit by it. So very strong skill, very meta right now in terms of PvE. And then in PvP, this really helps take off load from ranged caster builds such as the Magicka Nightblade or the Magicka Sork, because especially with Sorks, they're going to be using things like Crystal Frags and Force Pulse, and while you aren't going to be able to reflect it like Defensive Stance, you are able to consume it entirely and then heal yourself, so you'll pretty much be an unstoppable god. Now, you won't be able to kill them as easily because Absorb Magic removes that reflect, so you're not going to be doing damage, you're not going to be stunning them, but you will be healing a lot. So this is the go-to morph if you're doing group stuff, but if you're doing solo play, then in PvP, you'll probably want to do defensive stance. So in terms of morph choice, it's up to you. If you're a solo PvPer, probably going to want to go with the defensive stance. If you're a group PvPer or a PvEer, then you're going to want to use Absorb Magic, because both of these do have that 8% cost reduction and block damage increase, which really helps, and then their active components when used in proper application will be very, very strong. But now we'll go on to our next ability, and that is Shield Charge. And Shield Charge operates similarly to a gap closer such as Crit Rush or Ambush, meaning it will have a minimum range in which you can cast it. You have to be at least 3.5 meters away, and you can be no more than 22 meters away to cast this skill. It does cost quite a bit of stamina. It will scale with all of the same good stuff as our other skills, stamina, weapon damage, etc. Deals physical damage, and then it will also stun them for 2 seconds. So rather straightforward. If you look here, it's a pretty quick animation. It'll knock them down, and then the stun will start as soon as they're knocked down, and it will grant the enemies you cast it on CC immunity, which lasts 7 seconds. So in terms of a stun, it's not really meant to be used as a main stun. We're going to want a much longer lasting one, because 2 seconds for a 7-second window of CC immunity is not going to be used properly, but we can use it to prevent people from running away. If a healer is casting from afar and we need to get them as soon as possible, we can use this. We can use this on people using casts like Dark Flare or Dark Exchange or Beam even. So that's going to really help us cover some distance, as well as set us up to do some high burst damage, because opening an enemy up in terms of them being stunned allows us to do more damage to them, because we're going to be proccing our Exploiter passive if we have that from the ritual tree. They're not going to be able to heal unless they break free, or it's going to reduce their stamina pool, allowing us to do it again shortly. So very, very strong, but not meant as a spammable. So you can't really use this too much, so that's not going to be good in PvE, but in PvP that's going to be really, really fantastic. Now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Shielded Assault, and all it does is after we use the attack, we will gain a short damage shield that scales off of max health again. If we look here, if I change my bars where I have less max health, I will have a lesser shield. So there, again, just to demonstrate, 2,700 with my sword and shield out, and then when I lose some health on my dual wield, it goes down to 2,600. So it does scale off of max health, while the physical damage will scale with the same stuff. On top of it, scaling with the Bastion from Champion Point Systems, because it is a shield. So in terms of like a shield and defenses, Shielded Assault is really, really weak, because a 2,700 damage shield, like while I'm not min-maxed, I don't have CP, I don't have a lot of max health, it's going to be hit by Battle Spirit. So that's going to reduce the efficiency by 50%, meaning this already small shield is going to be even smaller. So I really don't like Shielded Assault. I'd like to see something else done with it. Perhaps emphasize the offensive shield user gameplay, like Power Bash and whatnot. I would love to see some application to that, because I really like the playstyle, but it's really lackluster at the moment. But now we'll look at our other morph, and that is called Invasion. And Invasion, instead of only stunning for 2 seconds, it will stun up to 88% longer based on the distance traveled. And we'll take this just to show that that does not increase with rank skill, so it's 88% no matter what. But it's going to stun for 3 seconds at rank 4, and then up to 88% longer if we cast this from max range. So really going to help stun an enemy longer, and this is going to be the other morph that we'll want to take. We'll see over a 5-second stun when I cast it from far away. So really, really strong in terms of CC duration, making it so if an enemy doesn't have the stam to CC break, they're going to be taking a lot of punishment and just lie on the ground and probably lead to their death. So Invasion is the go-to morph that I take for PvP. but I don't use it all the time. This is kind of a niche spot, like it depends on what I'm doing, more open world stuff, like in duels, or if I'm running around doing small man, not really fighting big groups, because we're going to want a better skill that's going to be utilized more in combat, and invasion isn't going to be used as much. But now we'll go on to our last active ability, and that is Power Bash. Power Bash is an instant cast skill, casted again at a 5 meters radius, scaling with all the same stuff that our other stuff does, dealing some moderate physical damage. Notice that it does the least amount of damage out of our entire kit, and that's because if it did more, it'd be pretty strong. So not only does it deal some small to moderate damage, but it will also stun the enemy for 3 seconds simply for casting this. So we see here it weaves insanely easily, and it should be noted that you can block cast it. So let me get my stamina back. So see there, you didn't even see me do the animation, but the skill still goes off. So very easy to block cast, similar to Puncture. So very strong in terms of not only dealing damage, but also applying stun. So forcing an enemy to waste that stamina or to take that additional punishment. So very handy. Now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is the go-to PvP morph, and that is Reverberating Bash. And all it does is it inflicts major defile when we cast the skill on whatever enemy, reducing their healing received by 30% for 10 seconds. So the really nice thing about this is that it stuns for 3 seconds, and CC immunity goes up to 10 seconds, or goes up to 7 seconds next patch, so that means a 10-second duration in between casting it, which lines up perfectly with the debuff, meaning we should only be really casting this once per target every 10 seconds. Now, if you're trying to keep up the pressure and you don't have many other skills on your bar, you can spam cast this. However, the insanely high stamina cost will not really be efficient in those terms. And you can't CC an enemy more than once with this skill anymore. Before, there was a bug where Reverberating Bash was ignoring CC immunity, so you could use it with other CCs. It wouldn't, and it would like ignore CC immunity. I haven't been seeing that happen much lately, so I'm pretty sure that's all fixed up for the most part, which was very nice, because it was very frustrating to deal with before. But now we'll look at our other morph, and that is Power Slam. And Power Slam sort of reworks the skill. So not only will it remove the stun, but that loss of power will transition into additional damage. So we'll almost gain double the tooltip we see here, 3600 versus the 1900 there. So very strong in terms of damage. And we'll also gain a passive while having this skill slotted, where whenever we block an attack, it will increase the damage of our next Power Slam by 25%. So this means any attack we block for the next 5 seconds after, if we cast Power Slam, it'll do 25% more damage. So we don't have to be blocking, it means we have to have blocked an attack. So it doesn't need to be used only while blocking. That's the really nice part about it. So we see here, if I block, it will do the same exact damage as if I'm not blocking. So it has to block an attack to get that 25% more damage, but it allows for the more offensive sword and board route. So in PvP, or if for some reason you like to use it in PvE, you can gain a lot of free damage in terms of blocking stuff, because if you're blocking, this passive will constantly be refreshing, and it has no cooldown, meaning you'll constantly be doing additional damage. So not only does the tooltip get higher than anything in our kit, but we'll also be getting an additional 25% more, allowing for some much more offensive gains. Now, I would kind of like to see this increased a little bit more, or maybe to reduce the cost of Power Slam, because right now the offensive sword and board route doesn't work too well. You have to use more, you have to rely on other stuff that isn't very balanced, like tremor scale and stuff. So if tremor scale went out the window, then I'd love to see the more offensive sword and board route go. But as it stands right now, I can see why we wouldn't want to do that because of how strong tanks are at the moment. Because heavy armor and sword and shield, when used in tandem, makes a player very, very tanky. And thanks to sets like Knights Errant and Tremor Scale, they're able to do not only they're not only tanky, they're able to do lots and lots of damage. So if those things got changed up and tanks got a little bit more rebalanced in PvP, I'd love to see some of that power enter into Power Slam to allow for that offensive capability to stay within the class or to stay within the skill line, but in more balanced ways. Usually we'll want to go with the other morph, which is Reverberating Bash, just because that stun is going to be very helpful. Major Defile is very helpful, and we're not meant to really spam cast this as it stands, just because it costs so much stamina. Like I was talking about low slash costing a lot. Yeah, Power Slam costs even more. It's an extremely noticeable on my stamina bar in terms of how many times I can use this skill. So just see how quickly it drains. Now, it's easy to get this much lower with CP and cost reduction and stuff, so this isn't truly reflective, but as a base skill with my passives, it's still pretty hefty. And now we'll move on to our ultimate ability, and that is Shield Wall. Shield Wall costs a meager 100 ultimate, lasts a 6-second duration, and grants us the ability to block all attacks casted upon us within the next 6 seconds without having to block. So I'll demonstrate here. I place it down and I am now blocking, and I actually lose the ability to block. I cannot hold right click while this is active because it's already treating it as I am. So the really nice thing about this is the low cost allows it to be up like crazy in PvP, because ultimate generation in PvP is easier thanks to skills like Combat Frenzy, and utilization of other things like our passives. Like if we're a Nightblade, we'll have Catalyst, we'll have Soul Siphon, or we'll have Transfer, we'll have Soul Harvest, we'll have a lot of options for ultimate generation. Dragon Knights will have Blessing of the Mountain, Templars will have theirs. Like every class has an ability to make ultimates either cost cheaper or to generate faster, so Shield Wall is going to be able to be kept up quite a lot. Now, this is for PvP. In PvE, this is not a very strong ultimate because it allows us to block at no cost for 6 seconds, so no stamina degeneration, and since we aren't technically blocking, we will regenerate our stamina. But the issue in PvE is since we're not technically blocking, that anytime we get hit by a power attack, we will be knocked backwards. So this is ultimately the killer for PvE. Not only does it sacrifice a lot of efficiency from not casting things like Warhorn or Nova or some other buffing ultimate for our group, but it also doesn't do what it needs to do in PvE, which is make us immune to CC, because you're supposed to be immune to CC while you're blocking. However, since we're technically not blocking, we're not immune to CC. So we'll be able to be set off balance, we'll be able to be stunned, we'll be able to be knocked back, and that's going to really, really make this skill not good in PvE. But in PvP, it is a fantastic skill because it allows us to get 3 ticks of stamina regeneration. It doesn't drain stam to block, and it's going to reduce all damage we take while allowing us to freely cast since we're not having to block. So very, very strong. But now we'll look at our morphs, and our first morph is called Spell Wall, and Spell Wall now reflects all projectiles cast at you for the 6-second duration of the base morph. So very, very helpful. This works against physical and spell resistance attacks or penetrative attacks, so bows, staves, whatever it is, they will all be reflected by Spell Wall. So this is a really, really strong choice for the more offensive tank route where you're trying to punish the enemy, so get stuff back on at them. So the really nice thing about this is you can cast this right as an enemy uses a bow ultimate or crystal frags or a high damaging skill, and you'll be able to reflect things back at them, allowing for some heavy damage onto them while keeping yourself completely safe. So very, very nice morph choice. I like this for PvP. Our next morph is called Shield Discipline, which reduces all cost of our one hand and shield abilities. So when I say all costs, I mean all costs. As you see here, it says reduced by 100% while active. So this means any skill in this skill line will be can be casted for free, 0 stamina drain while active. So this is really the PvE morph if this skill was actually usable in PvE. And it can be used in PvP, especially in tandem with sets like Knights Errant, because Knights Errant is going to reward us every time we use the one-hand and shield ability. And if we can do that free of cost, we're going to be able to get a lot of healing and a lot of damage. So Shield Discipline is also a very nice offensive route if you're going to pair it with things like Knights Errant and just start spamming high damage like Power Slam. Shield Discipline and Power Slam paired together can do some crazy high damage because Power Slam's high cost is going to be negated. You're always going to be blocking attacks because Shield Discipline is going to do the same thing that base blocking will, and everything's free, so very, very strong choice as well. And the low cost is going to really allow us to keep that up. So if we're going the offensive route, we're going to be proccing Combat Frenzy, which means more Shield Discipline, which means more free damage. So very, very nice. But now we'll look at our passive abilities, and our first passive ability is called Fortress, and while we have a one-hand and shield weapon equipped, we will reduce the cost of all skills in the skill line by 10% and reduce the cost of blocking by 36%. Rather straightforward, and on its own it's a very hefty passive as the 36% block cost reduction goes a long way. Our next passive is called Sword and Board, which increases the weapon damage of our one-hand shield abilities by 5%, and again reduces the amount of damage we take while blocking by 20%. So this will apply to the base, just as Fortress. So Fortress is 18% and Sword and Board is 10%. So in tandem, they are 28% additional damage mitigation while blocking. Really going to help take off the pressure. Very, very strong in PvE and in PvP. And then the Sword and Board is going to give us that offensive route in PvP as well, especially when used with Knights Errant, because Knights Errant is going to do the same thing. It's going to add some weapon damage with their one-hand shield abilities. So since one-hand shield abilities get an additional 5%, that means Knight Errant's tooltip is 5% stronger. So very, very strong in terms of the offensive route. I wouldn't really change anything with these skills. I know people say they'd like to see more power put into one-hand and shield passives, but I mean, they have really strong passives when looking at these two. It's usually the other ones that are the issue, and we'll look at those now. The next passive we have is called Deadly Bash, and what Deadly Bash is going to do is it's going to improve your standard bash. So this attack right here, this is a bash. So if you just click while blocking, or if you have it bound to a secondary thing, we're going to do a bash attack. And bash attacks are meant to serve as an interrupt. So they'll apply weapon enchant, or they will not apply weapon enchants because you're attacking with your shield. They are not based off of your shield's power. They're based off of your weapon damage and stamina's power because that's what it scales with. And it costs stamina to bash. So it's going to reduce the cost of bashing by 40% and then increase the damage of bashing by 100%. So if we look here, if I bash doing 940 or 954 damage every bash, now I have 1531 weapon damage. But if I bar swap, I'm going to have 1964. But if we look here, I'm only doing 677 damage with bash. So this really improves the damage of bash, but right now, in and of itself, Deadly Bash isn't very good. Now, a long time ago, when this game first came out, the meta for PvE and PvP damage, believe it or not, was actually bash damage. You'd stack things like increased bash damage on jewelry. There were other sources. There were enchants for your shields, and Deadly Bash was even stronger, and you could easily kill players simply by just doing this over and over again in rapid succession. So you can't do that anymore, and Deadly Bash is a relic of the past in terms of how it fits into the game, because this was a big part of it back then. But since that meta is dead, for good reason, I would really like to see Deadly Bash incorporated with another passive and then a new one granted to them. But now we'll look at our next passive, and that is called Deflect Bolts. And while we have a one-hand and shield ability, we'll be able to reduce the damage we take while blocking from ranged attacks. So it says projectiles and ranged attacks. That means anything, spells or physical, so bows, staves, whatever they may be, will reduce the damage we take from them by 15% while blocking. And that will apply to the 50% base, meaning it's going to be a 7.5% damage mitigation of ranged attacks while blocking. So rather straightforward. Going to give us some extra tankiness. I'd kind of like to see this just be streamlined into a 7.5% damage mitigation while blocking instead of just projectiles. Or if they added something like a splinter effect where you reflected parts of the projectile, like 10% or 20% of the projectile cast at you back at the caster as damage, that would help out the offensive route as well while adding some flavor to the skill line. Because in and of itself, Deflect Bolts isn't going to be very strong. So if it wasn't changed, maybe morph that with the Deadly Bash thing and just conjoin them together. And then open up that new passive slot. And I'll give an idea of what I would really like to see after we go over our last passive, which is Battlefield Mobility. And that increases your movement speed while blocking by 60%. Because if you notice here, this is my base move speed without blocking. But if I block with dual wield, this is how fast I run. So almost the same speed as the base walk in game. So you're pretty much slowed to the pace of a snail, but if we have a sword and shield out, we move much faster. Almost base speed, not as fast, just a little bit slower, but it really helps us cover more distance. And while this doesn't seem like it's a very good passive, it's going to really help us cover distance in fights like Rakat or in Serpent, where we need to walk out of a conal or meteors are raining from the sky and we need to kite, but we can't drop blocks. So this is going to help us cover more distance. So very, very strong in PvE, but it doesn't really offer much in PvP. I would actually kind of like to see like a dodge roll or a sprint cost reduction put on this as well, maybe both, just so it could be used in PvE and in PvP a little bit more. Because as it stands, while it's effective, it doesn't really offer us many stats in terms of like cost reduction, which, I mean, your job as a tank is to hold block as long as you can. So when you have to dodge roll or sprint or something, it's very, very punishing on your resource pool. So if there was a little bit of a comeuppance in terms of like getting something back, that would be very helpful. But that is it. I think if we can join Deadly Bash and Deflect Bolts and then we added a new passive line, I would love to see something where you gain stats based on your weapon type you have. So sword, mace, or axe, similar to two-handeds, heavy weapons, or dual wields, twin blade, and blunt, which you gain a bonus based on what kind of weapon you use. So I would love to see some sort of bonus for that. I think like maces could increase the effectiveness of your armor reducing abilities by 20%. So when you apply the Crusher enchant or Major Breach with your taunt, increase the effectiveness of those by 20%. That would be cool. With axes, you apply a bleed that increases physical damage the enemy takes, that maybe stacks up to like 3 or 5%. Nothing too strong, but enabling some group DPS if you have a lot of stamina builds. And then maybe swords increase the block cost or increase the block damage cost. See if it has like a parry or something where you're able to block more attacks. So you could either reduce the cost or increase the block damage mitigation you gain while using a sword. Offering tanks an incentive to use different weapons other than just appearance, while also giving the tank some more utility to either themselves or the group, because a sword would be selfish. It'd be, okay, I want to reduce my costs. Or the axes or maces would be better for your group, because maces would increase your spell resistance or spell penetration and physical penetration of things like Major Minor Breach, Crusher enchant. And then axes would be good if you were to run with a lot of stamina builds, increasing the physical damage they take or just damage overall even. So I think that would really breed some diversity into the tanking skill line and make them a little bit more sought after, because right now the tanking role isn't really rewarded in PvE. There's so much personal responsibility on a tank, and so much of a fight hinges on how well you do your job. And usually when people do a good fight and everyone's looking at what went right, everyone's looking at how high DPS was or how little people died, and they aren't really giving tanks the attention they deserve, because a lot of DPS is revolved around how well your tanks are doing in terms of positioning, making sure mechanics aren't going off, applying that minor maim so they're not doing a lot of damage, negating damage so their healers can give more resources, etc. So I would really like to see some passives brought into the tanking skill line to make them seen more as the enabler role rather than just some person who holds block. So those are just my opinions, keep in mind. But still, the one-hand and shield skill line is very, very strong. It's the by far best choice to go for PvE tanking, even when the Ice Staff tanking comes out. The issue with that is they're only going to have a taunt on heavy attacks and then the inner fire taunt. They're not going to have these wonderful skills to use like debuffing, minor maim, reflex. They're not going to have stuns. So they're going to be missing out on a lot, and it's why one-hand and shield tanking will always remain the way to go for PvE. Now in PvP, tanks with sword and shield are still really, really strong, and a lot of damage builds even run them because it gives a lot of free tankiness. It's going to make us harder to kill, and that's the way to go in PvP. Is since burst is everything, if you can alleviate some of that burst and live longer just so you can do it back, sword and board is going to fit that role perfectly in terms of allowing you to take more punishment, getting your resources back, and waiting until all of your burst lines up to do the same thing to them. So a very, very strong skill line. I don't want to change too much with it. I think it's in a very good spot, but I would like to see some of the morphs like Ransack changed, as well as an additional passive that revolved around what weapon type you're using. But other than that, still pretty straightforward. Not a lot of min-maxing in terms of like how these skill operates. They're all very straightforward. The only really interesting mechanic is with retaining that defensive posture while we bar slap. So very, very straightforward skill line, but very effective. If I've misspoken at all in this video or I've missed something important, please drop a comment below. I'll make sure I add that in or comment on it and pin that. Hopefully you've learned something, but I will see you all next time.